On a cold night in 1815, Bristol's magistrates mobilized every watchman, city guard, and constable they could muster. The target wasn't a foreign invasion or a political uprising. It was a single criminal organization that had terrorized the roads around Bristol, Bath, and Gloucester for more than 3 decades. The authorities sent their forces into Kingswood Forest to arrest an entire gang in one coordinated night raid. This was the Cock Road Gang, a multi-generational crime empire built by intermarried families who turned a tiny hamlet on the outskirts of Bristol into the headquarters of Britain's most feared protection racket. They didn't hide in shadows or operate as outlaws on the run. They robbed travelers in broad daylight, ran structured extortion schemes where farmers paid according to the size of their estates, and became so entrenched that generations of the same families, the Caines, Bakers, Bryants, Bryants, and Fries, were hanged, transported, and imprisoned over the span of 40 years. Welcome to Clyde Crooks, where forgotten gang wars and underworld histories get dragged back into the light. If you want more stories of real gangs, real blood, and real consequences, subscribe and ring the bell. New episodes drop 4 times a week. Cock Road was, in the 18th century, a tiny hamlet on the outskirts of Bristol, within the lawless expanse of Kingswood Forest. The forest wasn't a picturesque nature reserve. It was a wild, unpoliced territory where royal authority barely reached and local law enforcement feared to tread. Though a small area, the exploits of the inhabitants brought Cock Road to the attention of the authorities of Bristol, Gloucestershire, and Somerset. It was claimed that a criminal gang, unmatched in notoriety, came from Cock Road. The reality was more complex. In the press, anyone committing a criminal act who lived in the forest was tarnished as a member of the gang. The name of the Cock Road Gang began to be bandied about by the newspapers, and while you probably would not want them living next door, they were nowhere near as bad as they were painted in sensational headlines. But that doesn't mean they weren't dangerous. They were engaged in horse stealing, burglary, highway robbery, and possibly the first ram raid in British criminal history. They had a structured protection racket where farmers paid according to the size of their estate. They had links in the area as well as up and down the country. And generations of the same families were hanged, transported, and imprisoned before the authorities finally broke them. To understand how the Cock Road Gang could operate openly for decades, you have to understand late 18th century Britain and the unique status of Kingswood Forest. At the end of the previous century, there were 50 offences for which the death penalty could be invoked, but by the end of the period covered by the gang's activities, it had reached 220. Most laws concerned the defence of property. The legal system was brutally harsh on paper, but weak in enforcement. Kingswood Forest sat on the border of 3 counties, Gloucestershire, Somerset, and Bristol's jurisdiction, which meant that criminals could exploit the gaps in authority. If Bristol's constables came looking, you could slip into Gloucestershire. If Gloucestershire pursued you, you could vanish into Somerset. The forest itself was dense, difficult to navigate for outsiders, and home to tight-knit communities who had lived there for generations. Strangers were noticed immediately, authorities were mistrusted, and the families of Cock Road had been there long enough to know every track, hideout, and safe house for miles. Taking their name from the small hamlet in which many of the members lived, the gang was made up of half a dozen or so intermarried families, the Caines, Bakers, Bryants, Bryants, and Fries. This wasn't a loose collection of criminals who happened to work together. This was a family business passed down through generations. The Caines family were at the center of the operation. Over decades, they built a criminal empire out of the chaos that resulted from living in what had been the lawless Kingswood Forest. Intermarriage between the families meant that everyone was related by blood or marriage, creating a network where loyalty was enforced by family ties and betrayal meant turning against your own kin. Children grew up learning the trade. Sons became highwaymen. Daughters married into other gang families, strengthening alliances. Cousins worked together on raids, and when one generation was hanged or transported, the next stepped up to continue the business. They primarily operated around the parish of Kingswood, but were also known to target travellers on lonely stretches of the roads that led in and out of Bristol, Bath and Gloucester. The geography was perfect for highway robbery. Wealthy merchants, officials and travellers had to pass through these roads, and the gang knew exactly where to strike. Sometime during the 1780s, a Mr. Crach was held up at gunpoint and robbed whilst travelling near the area. On another occasion, they robbed a man of 1 guinea and a silver watch on Keltston Road. A butcher named James Chappell from Brislington was targeted and robbed. These weren't desperate, opportunistic crimes. They were calculated operations by men who had been doing this for years and knew they could get away with it. One of the gang's most notorious members was Richard Haines, known as Dick Boy, from Oldland Common. He was connected with a gang of wicked boys, about 9 or 10 in number, possibly from the Cock Road gang, of which himself and one Carey were the principal leaders. Both turned to the adventurous crime of highway robbery. After committing various depredations in many parts, they directed their course towards Keltston Road, robbed a man of 1 guinea and a silver watch, for which they were both apprehended and tried at Taunton Assizes. Haines stood firm during his incarceration. His partner John Carey admitted to having robbed the butcher James Chappell from Brislington. It was on the 25th of August, 1787, in the Somerset town of Ilchester, that John Carey took the long, painful walk to the hangman's noose. A few days later, Richard Haines was transported from Newgate Prison, Bristol, to the gallows on St. Michael's Hill. According to an article in the Felix Farley Bristol Journal on the 26th of April 1800, he was accompanied by a Mr. Bundy, and both appeared to have continued with their hymn singing as the cart trundled through the streets of Bristol. Even facing execution, these men maintained their defiance. But highway robbery was only part of the operation. The Cock Road gang ran what was possibly the first structured protection racket in British criminal history. They were so well established and feared within the area that they would rob travellers in broad daylight and ran a structured protection racket where farmers paid according to the size of their estate. This wasn't a crude shakedown. It was organized, systematic, and scaled to what victims could afford. Small farmers paid less. Large landowners paid more. Everyone paid. The message was simple. Pay us and we leave you alone. Refuse and you risk losing far more than the protection money. Crops could be destroyed. Livestock could be stolen. Buildings could burn. And if you went to the authorities, the gang had enough reach to know who talked. The gang's criminal activities escalated over time. They engaged in horse stealing, a serious crime in an era when horses were essential for transportation, farming, and commerce. They committed burglary, breaking into homes and businesses across the region, and they may have been responsible for the first ram raid in British history. While the sources don't give details, the concept of using a vehicle or animal-drawn cart to smash through barriers and steal goods would have been revolutionary at the time. They also had links across the country, suggesting they were part of a wider network of criminal enterprises that could move stolen goods, provide safe houses, and share information. This wasn't a local gang limited to Kingswood. This was a criminal organization with national reach. information having been given to the magistrates that a gang of desperados infested the Cock Road neighborhood to such an extent that law-abiding citizens lived in constant fear, pressure began to mount for action. But taking action against the Cock Road gang was easier said than done. They had operated for decades with impunity. They had family networks that warned them of approaching authorities. They had safe houses throughout the forest. And they had the advantage of knowing the terrain far better than any constable from Bristol or magistrate from Gloucester. Early attempts to arrest gang members often failed. When two members were once apprehended for robbery and committed to Gloucester, the man who had them arrested accepted a bribe from the pair's friends, and they were released. Corruption was rampant. Officials could be bought. Witnesses could be intimidated. And juries were reluctant to convict local men, especially when those men had large families who might seek revenge. The turning point came after a series of murders and the slaying of a police officer. The authorities had tolerated robbery, extortion, and theft for years. But murder, especially the murder of a law enforcement officer, crossed a line. The Bristol magistrates decided that enough was enough. They couldn't keep losing officers, couldn't keep allowing merchants and farmers to be terrorized, and couldn't keep turning a blind eye to a criminal enterprise that had been operating openly for more than 30 years. They began planning a coordinated operation unlike anything the region had seen before. Instead of sending a few constables to make token arrests, they would mobilize every available man and strike all at once. They called together watchmen, city guards, and local constables and sent them out in force to arrest the entire gang in a nighttime raid. The raid in 1815 was a massive operation. Forces from Bristol, Gloucestershire, and Somerset coordinated their efforts, cutting off escape routes and surrounding the Cock Road hamlet under cover of darkness. The goal was to arrest as many gang members as possible in one swift action before word could spread and the targets could flee. When the authorities moved in, they caught the gang by surprise. Arrests were made across multiple households. Men, women, and even younger members of the families were taken into custody. The operation was a success. The backbone of the Cock Road gang, the intermarried families who had run the operation for decades, was finally broken. And the trials that followed were brutal. Generations of the same families were hanged, transported, and imprisoned. The authorities made examples of the leaders, ensuring that the sentences were harsh enough to deter anyone from trying to rebuild the organization. Transportation to Australia was a common punishment, effectively exiling gang members to the other side of the world where they could never return. Hangings were public spectacles designed to show that the law had finally won. Imprisonments broke up the family networks that had sustained the gang for so long. Children lost fathers, wives lost husbands. The criminal empire that had terrorized the roads around Bristol for more than 3 decades was dismantled in a matter of months. But the legacy of the Cock Road gang didn't disappear overnight. Bristol historically has had its fair share of gangs. From the infamous Kingswood Cock Road gang of the late 18th century to the St. Philip's Monkey Town mob of the early 20th century to the St. Paul's Aggie crew of the 1990s and early 2000s. The pattern repeats across generations. Different names, different territories, same fundamental logic. Control an area, exploit the gaps in law enforcement, build networks that protect members from prosecution, and profit from fear. The Cock Road gang proved that family-based criminal organizations could operate with impunity for decades if they had the right combination of geography, corruption, and community support. The name of the Cock Road gang was used by the press to describe any criminal from Kingswood, whether they were actually part of the organization or not. This created a mythology around the gang that was part truth and part exaggeration. In reality, anyone committing a criminal act who lived in the forest was tarnished as a member of the gang. Newspapers loved the story of a criminal empire hidden in the forest, and they played it up for dramatic effect. But the core truth remained. The Caines, Bakers, Brains, Bryants, and Fries had built a multi-generational crime family that ran protection rackets, highway robberies, horse stealing, and burglaries across 3 counties for more than 30 years. They weren't as bad as the press painted them in every sensational headline, but they were bad enough. They killed, they extorted, they terrorized, and they got away with it until the authorities finally mobilized the resources to take them down. The story of the Cock Road Gang matters because it shows how geography, family networks, and weak enforcement can create spaces where organized crime thrives. Kingswood Forest wasn't lawless because the people there were inherently criminal. It was lawless because it sat on the borders of 3 jurisdictions, making coordination difficult. It was lawless because the authorities in Bristol, Gloucestershire, and Somerset didn't communicate effectively. It was lawless because corruption allowed gang members to bribe their way out of prosecutions. And it was lawless because the legal system, despite having 220 offences punishable by death, couldn't effectively enforce those laws in areas where local communities protected their own. The Cock Road Gang exploited all of these weaknesses. They built a criminal empire in the gaps where authority was weak. They used family ties to ensure loyalty and silence. They intimidated witnesses and bribed officials. And they operated openly for decades because they knew that no single authority had the will or the resources to stop them. It took the full force of the authorities and the undermining of their way of life to stop the gang. The 1815 raid wasn't just about arresting criminals. It was about demonstrating that the state had the power to reach into areas that had been effectively autonomous for generations. It was about breaking up the family networks that sustained the gang, and it was about sending a message to anyone else who thought they could build a criminal empire in the forests around Bristol. The hangings, transportations, and imprisonments that followed weren't just punishments. They were public declarations that the era of the Cock Road Gang was over. Centuries later, the pattern repeats in city estates, docklands, and border towns. Different goods, different weapons, same logic. Control territory, exploit weak enforcement, build networks that ensure silence, and profit from fear. The Cock Road Gang are gone, their hamlet now absorbed into Greater Bristol, their names remembered only in local history books and academic papers, but their blueprint survives. Build a family-based organization, operate in areas where authority is weak or divided, run protection rackets that are systematic and scaled, cultivate corruption where possible, and when the state finally comes for you, they'll have to mobilize everything they've got. This is just one chapter in Britain's hidden underworld history. If you want more stories like this, from medieval outlaw armies to Glasgow's razor gangs, hit subscribe, drop a like, and tell us in the comments which gang story you want next. This is Clyde Crooks. See you in the next war.